The Christian in Complete Armor by William Gurnall. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 13. Chapter 2. The best of saints subject to decline in their graces, and why we are to endeavor a recovery of decays in grace. The second observable in the exhortation is taken from the verb which the apostle useth, take, which signifies not only to take, but to take again, or recover a thing which we have lost, or reassume a thing which for the present we have left. Now, the apostle writing to the saints at Ephesus, who, at least many of them, were not now to put on this armor by a conversation, or the first work of faith, which no doubt had already passed upon many among them, he, in regard of them and believers to the end of the world, hath a further meaning, an example, that they would put on more clothes where their armor hangs loose, and they would recover where they have let fall any duty or decay in any grace. So that the note is, doctrine, that the Christian should have an especial care to repair his broken armor, to recover his decayed graces. This armor may be battered. I might show sad examples in the several pieces. Was not Jacob's girdle of truth and sincerity unbuckled when he used the sinful policy to get the blessing? He was not the plain man then, but the supplanter. But he had as good have stayed God's time. He was paid home in his own kind. He puts a cheat on his father, and did not Laban put a cheat on him, giving Leah for Rachel? What say you of David's breastplate of righteousness in the matter of Uriah? Was it not shot through, and that holy man fearfully wounded, who lay almost a year, for aught we read of him, before he came to himself, so far as to be thoroughly sensible of his sin, till Nathan, a faithful surgeon, who was sent to search the wound and clear it of that dead flesh which had grown over it? And Jonah, otherwise a holy prophet, when God would send him on an errand to Nineveh, he hath his shoes to seek. I mean that preparation and readiness with which his mind should have been shod, to have gone at the first call. Good Hezekiah, we find how near his helmet of hope was of being beat off his head, who tells us himself what his thoughts were in the day of his distress, that he should not see the Lord in the land of the living, expecting that God would never let go his hold, till like a lion he hath broken his bones and at last made an end of him. Even Abraham himself, famous for faith, yet had his fits of unbelief and distrustful qualms coming over his valiant head. Now in this case, the Christian's care should be to get his armor speedily repaired. A battered helmet is next to no helmet. In point of present use, grace in its decay is like a man pulled off his legs by sickness. If some means be not used to recover it, little service will be done by it, or comfort received from it. Therefore Christ gives the church of Ephesus, to whom Paul wrote this epistle, this counsel, to remember from whence she had fallen, to repent and do her first works. How many does a declining Christian wrong at once? First he wrongs God, and that in a high degree, because God reckons upon more honor to be paid him in by his saints' grace than by all other talents which his creatures have to trade with in the world. He can in some sense better bear the open sins of the world than the decays of his saints' graces, than by abusing their talents, robbing him of his oil, flax, and wool. By the Christian, by the others, bereaved him of the glory which should be paid him from his faith, zeal, patience, self-denial, sincerity, and the rest. Suppose a master should trust one servant with his money and another with his child to look to. Would he not be more displeased to see his dear child hurt or almost killed by the negligence of the one than his money stolen by the carelessness of the other? Grace is the new creature, the birth of the Spirit. When this comes to any harm by the Christian's careless walking, it must needs go nearer the heart of God than the wrong he hath from the world, who are trusted with nothing like this. Secondly, he that declines in grace and labors not to repair it, he wrongs his brethren, who hath a share in another's grace. He wrongs his whole body, that seeks not cure for a wound in any member. We are bid to love one another. 2 John verse 5. But how should we show our love to one another? The very next words will direct us. And this is love, that we walk after his commandments. Indeed, we show little love to our brethren by sinning, whereby we are sure either to ensnare them or grieve them, and how to let grace go down, and sin not go up, is a riddle to any that know what they both are. Thirdly, the Christian wrongs himself in not endeavoring to repair his broken armor and recover his declining grace. But this he loses the evidence of his inheritance, or at least so blots it, that it cannot be so clearly perceived by him. A declining Christian must needs be a doubting Christian, because the common symptom of a hypocrite is to wear and waste his like a stake set in the ground which rots, while true grace, like the tree, grows. Is not this the knot which the devil puzzleth many poor souls withal, and finds them work for many years to untie? If thou wast a Christian, thou wouldst grow. Right saints grow from strength to strength, and thou goest from strength to weakness. They go up the hill to Zion, or every ordinance and providence is a step that bears them nearer to heaven. But thou goest down the hill and art further from thy salvation than when thou didst first believe, as thou thoughtest. And doth it stand with thy wisdom, Christian, to put a staff into the devil's hand, an argument into his mouth, to dispute against thy salvation with? If you held an estate by the life of a child, which upon the death of it should all go away from you, that child, I warrant you, should be well looked unto. His head should not ache, but you would post to the physician for counsel. I pray, what is your evidence for that glorious estate you hoped for? Is it not Christ within you? Is not this new creature, which may well be called Christ for its likeness to him, the young heir of heaven's glory? And when that is sick or weak, it is not time to use all means for its recovery? Well, thus thou canst never live nor die comfortably. Not live. A man in a consumption has little joy of his life. He neither finds sweetness in his meat, nor delight in his work, as an healthful man doth. Oh, how sweet is the promise to faith when active and vigorous! How easy the yoke of the command to the Christian, when his conscience is not galled with guilt, nor strength enfeebled by temptation. But the Christian, in a declining condition, takes not the promise. Every command is grievous, and every duty burdensome to him. He goes in pain like one whose foot is out of joint, though the way be ever so pleasant, and he is as unfit to die as he is to live. Such a one can like no more to hear the news of death than a tenant that wants his rent due doth to hear of the quarter day. This made David beg time of God, spare me a little, that I may recover my strength. Having shown you why the Christian should endeavor to recover his declining graces, it would be very requisite to give a word of counsel to the Christian. First, to direct him how to judge of the declining state of grace, that he may not pass a false judgment upon him therein. Secondly, to direct him, when he finds grace, to be in a declination, how he may recover it. End of chapter 2, having been read by Peter John Parisi. None of my audios are copyrighted. Please feel free to make as many copies as you desire to the glory of God. The Christian in Complete Armor by William Gurnall. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 13, chapter 3. A cautionary direction from what we may not, as also from what we may judge our graces to be in a declination. Question. First of the first. How may a Christian judge whether grace be declining in him or no? Answer. First I shall resolve this negatively, and show by what he is not to judge his grace to decline. Secondly, positively by what he may certainly conclude a decay of grace. First, negatively, and that in several particulars. First, Christian, do not judge grace to be fallen weaker, because thy sense of corruption is growing stronger. This oft lies at the bottom of poor souls' complaints in this case. Oh, they never felt pride, hypocrisy, and other corruptions so haunt them as now. None knows how they are vexed with these and the like besides themselves. Now, let me ask thee, who makes this sad moan? Whether thou dost not think these corruptions were in thee before thou didst thus feel them? How oft hast thou prayed as formerly and not been troubled? How oft hast thou stood chatting with the same lust, and thy soul hath not been laid low before the Lord with such abasement of thyself as now? Deal faithfully between God and thy soul, and tell not a lie for God by bearing false witness against thyself. If it be thus, thou hast rather a comfortable sign of grace, growing than decaying. Sin cannot be on the getting hand if the sense of sin grow quick. This is the contemporary of a thriving soul, none so full of complaints of their own hearts as such. The least sin goes now to their very souls, which makes them think worse of themselves than ever. But it is not the increase of sin in them, but the advance of their love to Christ makes them judge so. When the sun shines with some power and the year gets up, we observe, though we may have frost and snow, yet they do not lie together, but are soon dissolved by the sun. Oh, it is a sweet sign that the love of Christ shines with a force upon thy soul, that no corruption can lie long in thy bosom, but they melt into sorrow and bitter complaints, that is, the decaying soul, where sin lies bound up and frozen, little sense of or sorrow for it appears. Secondly, take heed thou thinkest not grace decays, because thy comfort withdraws. The influence of the sun comes from where the light of it is not to be found, yea, as mighty as appears in those mines of gold and silver which are concocted by the same. And so may the actings of grace be vigorous in thee when least under the shining of thy countenance. Did ever faith triumph more than in our Savior crying, My God, my God? Here, faith was at its meridian when it was midnight in respect of joy. Possibly thou comest from an ordinance and bringest not home with thee those sheaves of comfort thou used to do, and therefore concludest grace acted not in thee as formerly. Truly, if thou hast nothing else to go by, thou mayest wrong the grace of God in thee exceedingly, because thy comfort is extrinsical to thy duty, a boon which God may give or not, yea, doth give to the weak and deny to the strong. The traveler may go as fast and ride as much ground when the sun doth not shine as when it doth, though indeed he goes not so merrily on his journey. Nay, sometimes he makes the more haste. The warm sun makes him sometimes to lie down and loiter, but when dark and cold he puts on with more speed. Some graces thrive best like some flowers in the shade, such as humility, dependency on God, etc. Thirdly, take heed thou dost not mistake, and think thy grace decays, when may be it is only thy temptations increase and not thy grace decreases. If you should hear a man say, because he cannot today run so fast, when 100 weight is on his back as he could yesterday, without any such a burden, that therefore he was growing weaker, you would soon tell him where his mistake lies. Temptation lies not in the same heaviness, always upon the Christian's shoulder. Observe therefore whether Satan is not more than ordinary let loose to assault thee, whether thy temptations come not with more force and violency than ever. Possibly, though thou didst not with the same facility overcome these as thou hast done less, yet grace may act stronger in conflicting with the greater than in overcoming the less. The same ship, when light ballast and favored with the wind goes mounting, at another time deeply laden and going against the wind and tide may move with a slow pace, yet they in the ship take more pains to make it sail thus than they did when it went faster. Secondly, positively, how thou mayest conclude that grace is declining, and that in a threefold respect. First, in reference to temptations to sin. Secondly, in reference to the duties of God's worship. Thirdly, the frame of thy heart in worldly employments. First, in reference to sin, and that is threefold. First, when thou art not so wakeful to discover the encroaching of sin upon thee as formerly, as at one time we find David's heart smote him when he but rent the skirt of Saul's garment. At another time, when his eye glanced on Bathsheba, he takes no such notice of the snare Satan had him in, and so is led from one sin to another, which plainly shows that grace in him was heavy-eyed, and his heart not in so holy a frame as it had been. If an enemy comes up to the gates, and the sentinel not so much as gives an alarm to the city of his approach, it shows he is off his guard, either fallen asleep or worse. If grace were awake, and thy conscience had not contracted some hardness, it would do its office. Secondly, when a temptation to sin is discovered, and thou findest thy heart shut up, that thou dost not pray against it, or not with that zeal and holy indignation as formerly upon such occasions, it is a bad sign that lust hath got an advantage of thy grace, that thou canst not readily betake thyself to thyself to thy arms. Thy affections are bribed, and this makes thee so cold a suitor as the throne of grace for help against thy enemy. Thirdly, when the arguments prevailing most with thee to resist temptations to sin, or to moan for sin committed, are more carnal and less evangelical than formerly, may be thou rememberest when thy love to Christ would have split fire on the face of Satan, tempting thee to such a sin, but now that holy fire is so abated, that if there were not some other carnal motives to make thee vote full, it would hazard to be carried for it rather than against it. And so in mourning for a sin, there is possibly now some slavish arguments, like an onion in the eye, which makes thee weep rather than pure ingenuity arising from the love to God whom thou hast offended. This speaks of sad decay, and the more mixture there is of such carnal arguments, either in the resisting of or the mourning for sin, the greater the declination of grace is. David's natural heat sure was much decayed when he needed so many clothes to be laid on him, and yet feels so little heat. The time was he would have sweat with fewer. I am afraid of many their love to Christ would be found in these declining times to have lost so much of its youthful vigor that what would formerly have been put them into a holy fury and burning zeal against some sins, such as Sabbath-breaking, pride of apparel, neglect of family duties, etc., hath now much ado to keep any heat at all in them against the same. Secondly, in point of duties of the worship, first, if thy heart doth not prompt thee with that forwardness and readiness as formerly to hold communion with God in any duty, possibly thou knowest the time when thy heart echoed back to the motions of God's Spirit, bidding thee seek his face. Thy face, Lord, will I seek. Yea, thou didst long as much a Sabbath or sermon season came, as a carnal wrench doth till it be gone. But now thy pulse doth not beat so quick a march to the ordinances, public or secret. Nature cannot but decay if appetite to food go away. A craving soul is a thriving soul, such a child that will not let his mother rest, but is frequently crying for the breast. Secondly, when thou declinest in thy care to perform duties in a spiritual sort, or to preserve the sense of those more inward failings, which in duty none but thyself can check thee of, it is not frequency in duty, but spirituality in duty causing thriving, and therefore neglect in this point soon brings grace into a consumptive posture. Possibly, soul, the time was thou wert not satisfied with praying, but thou didst watch thy heart strictly, as a man would every piece in the sum of money he pays, lest he should wrong his friend with any brass or uncurrent coin. Thou wouldst have God not only have duty, but duty stamped with that faith which makes it current. Have that zeal and sincerity which makes it gospel weight. But now thou art more careless and formal. Oh, look to it, poor soul, thou wilt, if thou continue thus careless, melt in thy spiritual estate apace. Such dealings will spoil thy trade with heaven. God will not take off these flighty duties at thy hands. Thirdly, when a Christian gets little spiritual nourishment from communion with God to what he hath done, the time hath been, may be, thou couldst show what came of thy praying, hearing, and fasting. But now the case is altered. There is a double strength in the communion which God imparts to a soul in a healthy disposition, strength to faith and strength for our obedient walk. Dost thou hear and pray and get no more strength to hold by a promise, no more power over or brokenness of heart under thy usual corruptions? What, come down the mountain, break the tables of God's law as soon as thou art off the place? As deep in thy passion, as uneven in thy course as before, there is a sure decay of that inward heat which should and would, if his right temper, suck some nourishment from these. Thirdly, by thy behavior and thy worldly employments. First, when thy worldly occasions do not leave thee in so free and spiritual a disposition to return into the presence of God as formerly, it may be thou couldst have come from thy shop and family employments to thy closet and find that they have kept thee in frame, yea, perhaps delivered thee up in a better frame for those duties. But now it is otherwise. Thou canst not so shake them off, but they cleave to thy spirit and give an earthly savor to thy praying and hearing. Thou hast reason to bewail it. When nature decays, men go more stooping, and it is a sign some such decay is in thee, that thou canst not, as thou used to, lift up thy heart with from earthly to spiritual duties. They were intended as helps against temptation, and therefore, when they prove snares to us, there is a distemper in us. If we wax worse after sleep, the body is not right, because the nature of sleep is to refresh. If exercise indisposes for work, the reason is in our bodies. So here. Secondly, when thy diligence in thy particular calling is more selfish, possibly thou hast wrought in thy shop and sat close at thy study, in obediency to the command chiefly, thy carnal interests have swayed but little with thee, but now thou tradest more for thyself and less for God. Oh, have a care of this. Thirdly, when thou canst not bear the disappointment of thy carnal ends in thy particular calling, as thou hast done, thou workest and gettest little of the world, thou preachest and art not much esteemed, and thou knowest not well how to brook these. The time when thou couldst retire thyself into God and make up all thou didst want elsewhere in him, but now thou art not so well satisfied with thy state, rank, and condition. Thy heart is fingering for more of these than God allows thee. This shows declining. Children are harder to be pleased than old men, whose decay of nature makes them more forward and in a manner children the second time than others. Labor, therefore, to recover thy decaying grace, and as this lot grows, so thy strength with it will, to acquiesce in the pleasure of God's providency. End of chapter 3, having been read by Peter John Paresis. None of my audios are copyrighted. Please feel free to make as many copies as you desire to the glory of God. The Christian in Complete Armor by William Gurnall. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 13. Chapter 4. A word of counsel for the recovery of declining grace. We come now to give a few directions to the Christian how to recover decaying grace. Inquire faithfully into the cause of thy declining. The Christian's armor decays two ways, either by violent battery, when the Christian is overcome by temptation to sin, or else by neglecting to furbish and scour it with the use of those means which are as oil to keep it clean and bright. Now, inquire which of these have been the cause of thy delay. It is likely both concur. First, if thy grace be weakened by any blow given it, by any sin committed by thee, there then lies a threefold duty upon thee towards the recovery of it. First, thou art to renew thy repentancy. It is Christ's counsel. Revelations 2:5. To emphasis, repent and do thy first works, where it is not only commanded as a duty, but prescribed as a means for her recovery, as if he had said, repent that thou mayest do thy first works. Lo. Hosea chapter 14, verse 2. The Lord sets backsliding Israel about this work, bidding her take words and turn to the Lord. And verse 4. He then tells her he will take her in hand to recover her of her sins. I will heal their backslidings. A repenting soul is under promise of healing, and therefore, Christian, go and search thy heart as thou wouldest do thy house. If some thief or murderer lay hid in it to cut thy throat in the night. When thou hast found the sin that has done thee the mischief, then labor to fill thy heart with shame for it and indignation against it, and so go big with sorrow, and cast it forth before the Lord in a heartbreaking confession. Better thou do this than Satan do thy errand to God for thee. Secondly, when thou dost hast renewed thy repentancy, forget not, delay not then to renew thy faith on the promise for pardon. Repentancy, that is like purging physic to evaluate the peccant humor, but if faith come not presently from its restorative, the poor creature will never get heart or recover his strength. A soul may die of a flux of sorrow as well as of sin. Faith hath an incarnating virtue, as they say of some strengthening meats. It feeds upon the promise, and that is perfect converting, or rather restoring the soul. Psalms 19:7. Though thou wert pinned to skin and bones, all thy strength wasted, yet faith would soon recruit thee and enable every grace to perform its office cheerfully. Faith sucks peace from the promise, called peace in believing. From peace flows joy. Being justified by faith, we have peace with God. Romans 5:1 and verse 2. We rejoice in hope of glory, and joy affords strength. The joy of the Lord is our strength. Thirdly, back both these with a daily endeavor to mortify those lusts which most prevail over thy grace. Weeds cannot thrive, and flowers also. When grace does not act vigorously and freely, conclude it is oppressed with some contrary lust, which weighs down its spirits and makes them lumpish, even as superfluous humors do load the natural spirits in our bodies, that we have little joy to stir or go about any business till they be evacuated, and therefore apply this work close. It is not a day's work or two in the year, like physics at spring or fall, nothing more vain than to make a bustle, as the papists do at their Lent, or as some unsound professors among ourselves, who seem to bestir themselves before a sacrament or day of fasting with a great noise of zeal, and then let those very lusts live peaceably in them all the year after. No, this is child play, to do and undo. Thou must mortify daily thy lust before by the Spirit. Romans 8:13. Follow but this work conscientiously in thy Christian course, making it thy endeavor as constantly as the laboring man goes out every day to work in the field where his calling lies, to watch thy heart and use all means for the discovery of sin, and as it breaks forth, to be humbled for it, and be chopping at the root of it with the axe of mortification. And thou shalt see by the blessing of God what a change for the better there will be in the constitution of thy grace. Thou, who art now so poor, so pale, that thou art afraid to see thy own face long in the glass of thy own conscience, thou shalt then reflect with joy upon thy own conscience, and dare to converse with thyself without those surprisals of horror and fear which before did appall thee. Thy grace, though it shall not be thy rejoicing, yet it will be thy evidence for Christ, in whom it is, and lead thee in thy boldness to lay claim to him, while the loose Christian, whose grace is overthrown with lust, nor want of this weeding hook, shall stand trembling at the door, questioning whether his grace be true or no, and from that doubt of his welcome. Secondly, if, upon inquiry, thou findest that thy armor decays, rather for want of scouring than for any blow from sin presumptuously committed, as that is most common and ordinary, rust will soon spoil the best armor, and negligence give grace its blame, as well as gross sins. Then apply thyself to the use of those means which God hath appointed for strengthening grace. If the fire goes out by taking off the wood, what may preserve it but by laying it on again? First, I shall send thee to the Word of God. Be more frequently conversant with it. David tells us where he renewed his spiritual life and got his soul so often to a heavenly heat when grace in him began to chill. The word, he tells us, quickened him. This was the sunny bank he sat under. The word draws forth the Christian's grace. By presenting everyone with an object suitable to act upon, this is of great power to rouse them up, as the coming of a friend makes us, though sleepy before, shake off all drowsiness to enjoy his company. Affections are actuated when their object is before them. If we love a person, this is excited by sight of him. If we hate one, our blood rises much more against him when before us. Now the word brings the Christian's graces and their objects together. Here love may delight herself with the beholding Christ, who is set out to live life there in all his love and loveliness. Here the Christian may see his sins in a glass that will not flatter him. And can there any sorrow, godly sorrow be in the heart, any hatred of sin, and not come forth while the man is reading what they cost Christ for them? Secondly, from the world go to meditation. This is a bellows to the fire. That grace which lies chalked and eaten up for want of exercise will by this be cleared and break forth. While thou art musing, this fire will burn, and thy heart grow hot within thee. According to the nature of the subject, thy thoughts dwell upon. Resolve therefore, Christian, to enclose some time from all worldly suitors, wherein thou mayest every day, if possible, at least take a view of the most remarkable occurrences that have passed between God and thee. First ask thy soul what takings it hath had that day, what mercies heaven hath sent in to thee, and do not, when thou hast asked the question, like Pilate, go out, but stay till thy soul hath made report of God's gracious dealings with thee. And if thou art wise to observe and faithful to relate them, thy conscience must tell thee that the cock was never turned, the breast of mercy never put up all the day. Yea, while thou art viewing these fresh memories, telling over this new coin, hot out of the mint of God's bounty, ancient mercies will come crowding in upon thee and call for a place in thy thoughts and tell thee what God hath done for thee months and years ago. And indeed, owed debts should not be paid last. Give them, Christian, all a hearing one time or another, and thou shalt see how that they work upon thy ingenious spirit. It is with the Christian in this case as with some merchant servant that keeps his master's cash. He tells his master he hath a great sum of his by him, and desires he would discharge him of it, and see how his accounts stand. But he can never find him at leisure. There is a great treasury of mercy always in the Christian's hands, and conscious of oft calling the Christian to take the account and see what God has done for him. But seldom it is he can find time to tell his mercies over, and it is any wonder that such should go behindhand in their spiritual estate, who take no more notice what the gracious dealings of God are with them. How can he be thankful that seldom thinks of what he receives, or patient when God afflicts? That wants one of the most powerful arguments to pacify a mutinous spirit in trouble, and that is taken from the abundant good we receive at the hands of the Lord, as well as a little evil. How can such a soul's love flame to God that is kept at such a distance from the mercies of God which are fuel to it? And the like may be said of all the other graces. Secondly, reflect upon thyself, and bestow a few serious thoughts upon thine own behavior, what it hath been towards God and man all along the day. Ask thy soul, as Elisha his servant, whence comest thou, O my soul? Where hast thou been? What hast thou done for God today, and how? And when thou goest about this, look that thou neither art taken off from a thorough search as Jacob was by Rachel's specific excuse, nor to be found to excuse thyself, as Eli his sons, when thou shalt upon inquiry take thy heart tardy to any point of duty. Take heed what thou doest, for thou judgest for God, who receiveth the wrong by thy sin, and therefore will do himself justice, if thou wilt not. Thirdly, from meditation go to prayer. Indeed, a soul in meditation is on his way to prayer. That duty leads the Christian to this, and this help brings help to that. When the Christian has done his utmost by meditation to excite his graces and chase his spirit into some divine heat, he knows all this is but to lay the wood in order. The fire must come from above to kindle, and this must be fetched by prayer. They say stars have greatest influence when they are in conjunction with the sun. Then, sure, the graces of a saint should never work more powerfully than in prayer, for then he is in the nearest conjunction and communion with God. That ordinance which has such power with God must needs have a mighty influence on ourselves. It will not let God rest, but rises him up to his people secure, and it is any wonder if it be a means to rouse up and excite the Christian's grace? How oft do we see a dark cloud upon David's spirit at the beginning of his prayer, which by that time he is a little warm in his work begins to clear up, and before he ends, breaks forth into high actings of faith and acclamation of praise. Only here, Christian, take heed of formal praying. This is as banful to grace as not praying. A plaster, though proper, and of sovereign virtue, yet if it be laid on cold, may do more hurt than good. Fourthly, to all the former join fellowship and communion with the saints thou livest among. No wonder to hear a house is robbed that stands far from neighbors. He that walks in communion of saints, he travels in company. He dwells in a city where one house keeps up another, to which Jerusalem is compared. It is observable concerning the house in whose ruins Jacob's children were entombed, that a wind came from the wilderness and smote the four corners of it. It seems it stood alone. The devil knows what he does in hindering this great ordinance of communion of saints. In doing this, he hinders the progress of grace, yea, brings that which Christians have into a declining, wasting state. The apostle couples these two duties close together, to hold fast our profession and consider one another and provoke unto love and to good works. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 23 and 24. Indeed, it is a dangerous step to apostasy to forsake the communion of saints. Hence it is said of Demas, he hath left us and embraced the present world. Oh, what mischief hath Satan done us in these few last years in this one particular? What is become of this communion of saints, where are two or three to be found that can agree to walk together? Those that could formerly pray together cannot sit together at their Father's table, can hardly pray one with or one for another. The breath of one Christian is strange to another that once lay in his bosom. This is a lamentation and shall be for a lamentation. End of chapter 4. Having been read by Peter John Parisi. None of my audios are copyrighted. Please feel free to make as many copies as you desire to the glory of God.